Hello. Today, let's take a deep dive into Francis Poulenc's motet Salve, Regina. Poulenc was an interesting character. He lived in France in the first half of the 20th century, which was, in many ways, not a very happy place and time to be, more of which later. He was brought up as a Catholic and drifted away from religion as a teenager, but then a close friend died when Poulenc was 37, and he undertook a pilgrimage which, by all accounts, seemed to have led to the rediscovery of his faith. Now, be that as it may, it certainly seems to be a turning point in terms of his compositions. On top of the fun and quirky and often humorous stuff he was already writing, he also began to come out with deeply sincere religious music, including, for the first time, music for choirs. Salve Regina is one of those. It was written in May 1941, smack bang in the middle of the Nazi occupation of Paris, a pretty grim time for Poulenc, who was a French patriot and an active member of the French resistance. The text he chooses here is a prayer to the Virgin Mary, but a very dark one, in which we implore Mary to lend us strength as we suffer in the vale of tears. And musically, it is very much what you'd expect given those influences. It's intense, dark, meditative, very inward-looking. You can kind of get the vibe from the instruction Poulenc writes towards the end of the piece. Very gentle and clear, and dans le style d'une complainte. Now, une complainte can mean a complaint, but in literary context it also means a lament. And I think that's what's intended here. A lament is not a list of complaints or a demand for action, but just like a catalogue of woes, an expression of unhappiness, with the hope that the audience will look kindly on them. In this case, the audience is, of course, the Virgin Mary, who's such a central figure in Catholicism. There's lots to say about the music, but first and foremost, how are you going to approach it with the choir? This isn't an easy piece, and I presume if you're tackling it at all, you're tackling it with singers who don't expect to be taught note by note or line by line because they have some sight reading facility themselves. Given this, it's certainly worth trying to get from start to finish without fussing too much over details so that singers get a feel for the whole piece. And I don't think any harm is done by supporting that first survey with piano accompaniment if it helps, which it will. But there's so much to examine and work on in this piece that you're quickly going to have to break it down into chunks. The good news is that it can be sliced and diced easily phrase by phrase. Also, there are plenty of challenging vocal lines, but as a rule they're internal to each phrase, and it's mostly homophonic. Transitions between phrases are not particularly the issue here. All this means that you can choose a few bars to put under the spotlight, dissect them, talk about them, work on them, and then put them back together, taking the time you need, and then move on to the next chunk when you're ready. And let's be clear, no matter how accomplished your choir, you are going to need to do this kind of focused work on this piece. It's just not one of those songs that will sing itself, as they say, once you get familiar. And the level of detail that Poulenc has woven into his music means that every choir, no matter how accomplished, has plenty to discover and plenty to work on. I'm not going to walk through every difficult note and interval because we'd be here all day. Let's make some general observations instead. This piece, like a lot of Poulenc's choral writing, demands very precise and intelligent chromatic accuracy, not to mention a great deal of confidence. Singing it with a small group, which is what it deserves if you ask me, this is not big choir music. That's a challenge. The music is full of dissonances, and while these are always beautiful and fleeting and never distract from the beautiful melody, they demand real precision in pitching and intonation as well as familiarity with the harmonies. And that need for familiarity is another reason why I think detailed phrase-by-phrase work is important. If you have a choir which learns its notes in rehearsal, as opposed to studying at home or indeed very strong sight reading, then they are going to benefit hugely from growing familiarity with the sound as you repeat and work on each phrase. Every vocal part has challenging passages when you sing it in isolation, and unlike pieces we've looked at in other videos, it does not automatically click into place when you put the parts together. That too takes work. The last 4 bars are a good example. And there are plenty more awkward bits. Sometimes even when it looks easy, it's not, because the context is so sensitive. Here's bar 48, for instance. Then there's this infamous bit right in the middle of the piece. At the moment, Jesus is first mentioned, incidentally. Although it's only 4 notes repeated in sequence, it's pretty much a totemic example of chromatic pitching. You can only tune it by knowing exactly what you're singing yourself, and at the same time listening intently to everyone around you. This is a good moment to mention that the audio clips I'm using for this video are from the Apollo 5 ensemble, which is not the most polished recording, as you might have noticed just there. They fluff the exposed bit slightly. But it is by far the clearest I can find, and it's a small group, which makes the parts easy to hear. What else can I say about notes and note bashing? Well, most of the time the individual lines are awkward because they simply have to be to produce the gorgeous dissonances Poulenc wants. Bars 24 to 25, another example of that spectacular beauty. But because this is Poulenc, there's the added complication that sometimes the lines are hard even when seemingly they don't need to be. He simply loves crossing over parts, especially alto and tenor, and to be honest, his reasons for doing so are sometimes a bit hard to fathom. For instance, here in bars 18 and 19, altos and tenors cross, and this makes the alto line a bit tricky. Now, maybe the reason for the part crossing is to preserve this melodic line in the tenors and to give the altos those really resonant low Gs. Alright, I can buy that. Sorry about the leaps altos, but, suck it up. Exhibit B, this is bar 11. The parts cross here because Poulenc wants to keep the texture moving towards the cadence rather than just writing what would be basically much easier to sing for tenors and produce exactly the same harmonies without the weird interleaving. Again, alright, that's the composer's prerogative, though giving tenors that top G and then making them leap down the 7th seems kind of counterproductive because that's naturally going to stick out like a sore thumb in tenor register, and surely that's not the intention. Then there's bar 17, where the altos have a totally unnecessary hard bit, which the tenors could totally have covered. And so on and so on. I mean, you can always come up with inventive justifications for these. And I don't deny Poulenc knew what he was doing. But really, after a while, it starts to look kind of capricious. Like, oops, I seem to have written a naturally singable line here, better mess it up if anyone notices. I guess I am kidding, but one way or another, Poulenc very much wants what he wants, and he isn't afraid to challenge singers to deliver it. While we're on the subject of being demanding, Poulenc also has no qualms about dishing out high notes at quiet dynamics. For both sopranos and tenors, these are extraordinarily beautiful moments when you pull them off, especially this top A flat at the climax of the piece. Wow, it's spine-tingling. But my gosh, you need a lot of breath support and preparation and vowel shaping and smart intonation and confidence. At least that one's on a nice vowel. Ask singers to breathe with the O shape already formed and land cleanly on that note, as it were, from above. And of course, once they've done it, that descending phrase has some alarm bells attached to it too. It needs direction, and it needs to be delivered with as much support and attention to tone as the first note was to avoid a slump of tone, tuning, or energy as sopranos come back down into a more comfortable register. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I've said already this piece is rich in detail, and now's the time to talk about some of that. Poulenc shows an exquisite mastery of detail, and a lot of it is fleeting and subtle, hidden away in the middle of the texture so that you might miss it the first few times you hear it. That's one reason why Poulenc is rewarding to performers as well as audiences, because performers get to enjoy the details that first-time listeners might overlook. Here are two lovely examples of what I mean. Look at bars 52 and 53. Harmony's the same, melody the same, but doesn't the change to the bass line just add a whole extra dimension of expression? And another game of Spot the Difference, bars 31 to 34. What difference? This difference. Minor the first time, major the second time. So brief, so easily missed, but so beautiful when you notice it's there. Now, it's not like these differences always demand a change of performance from your singers. In fact, I think they rarely do. They're just there because Poulenc wants them there. Even so, I do recommend drawing attention to these kinds of things in rehearsal and letting singers reflect on them when they sing, if for no other reason than it will increase their appreciation of the beauty of their music. While we're looking at these bars, here's another of Poulenc's little touches. He's writing in a clustered texture with basses high up at the top of the staff, but then he drops that one seemingly random bass note down the octave each time. Why do it? Because it adds a momentary, unexpected depth of texture, which is gorgeous. And why choose that particular note to drop? I have no idea. I have a feeling Poulenc just liked being a bit mischievous, even in the middle of a serious piece like this. But it's worth paying attention to in rehearsal because it implies a switch for basses from tenor to bass register and back again, which needs care to keep the intonation spot on. I also want to mention these rests. This is bar 4, but he pulls the same trick in bar 8 and again in 23. These are very special rests. The purpose of these rests is not just to provide a bit of variation, they also suddenly disrupt the otherwise regular pulse. In these moments, the mood is briefly no longer plaintive like a lament, but gasping and desperate. For singers and for you, it's all in the breath. If you as a conductor give a sharp intake of breath there, vita dulcedo, your singers will follow suit and the phrase will be suddenly energized. If you take the breath more calmly, vita dulcedo, the singers will give you something more legato and smooth. You don't need to brief your singers about this because, as is often the case with breathing, what you do will automatically shape what they do. But that means you do need to pay attention to it yourself. While we're talking about mood changes, look at the dynamic palette Poulenc helps himself to. He writes literally every available marking, from forte all the way down to PPP at the end. Again, let it never be said that he doesn't know what he wants. Really encourage your singers to pay attention to these. In pieces like this, where the composer is so precise about intentions, I sometimes ask the choir to imagine that a member of the audience has a copy of the score with dynamics erased, and the idea is that they should be able to discern what Poulenc wrote just by listening to the performance and saying to themselves, that's clearly MF, oh yes, that's P, that's double P, that's triple P. I mean, obviously that would be a really annoying way for someone to actually listen to the piece, but the point is to focus singers' minds on really communicating all 6 or 7 different gradations of dynamic. Nor should we imagine a dynamic shape is flat within phrases. Sometimes Poulenc writes hairpins, but even when he doesn't, we need really pronounced phrasing. It's especially important to shape the opening phrases by being aware of the important syllables, salve, regina, and lightening the ends of phrases really dramatically. Salve, regina, mater misericordiae, vita dulcedo. This phrase shape with its almost completely vanishing tail is so characteristic of Poulenc's unaccompanied choir writing that one group I work with took to calling it Poulenc phrasing. Setting aside everything I've said so far, I think that perfecting this one technique, throwing away the ends of phrases, is the single most important thing you can do to transform the way you sing this piece. Another characteristic of Poulenc is the sheer intensity of his quiet passages. I've said before that there are 2 kinds of quiet singing. the gentle pastoral kind, and the intense and arresting kind. Nearly all of this piece falls into the intense category. You simply can't relax. Breath support, tuning, and above all, constant listening and constant subtle adjustments to blend with what's going on around you. This is the only way to sing Poulenc's quiet passages. The aim is not for the audience to feel relaxed, but to feel electrified. Incidentally, let me mention, because this is almost universally a cold and dark piece, that there are just 2 bars of true warmth. I already mentioned that it's clear, at least here, why the parts overlap, to let the altos render those gorgeous low Gs. It's also, by the way, the longest stretch of major key anywhere in the piece. Listen and enjoy. The last thing I want to mention is the words, and specifically the way Poulenc sets the Latin with almost no regard to which syllables would normally be emphasised and which would not. This is also a habit of Poulenc, and I don't know whether it's to do with his being French, or he does it on purpose, or he just doesn't care, or what. But there's very clearly a tension between the harmonic and rhythmic emphasis on one hand, and the lyrical emphasis on the other. And it's not like Renaissance music where we know to break the tie in favour of the words, because Poulenc is, as always, very exact about what he wants, changing time signatures freely to make it clear which beats he means to be the strong ones. So I think we have no choice. We have to forget what we know about Latin and just follow the scent of the music. And when this produces strange things like ad vocata nostra or in hac lacrima rum valle, well, it's nonsense, but it is indisputably what's written on the page. And if you try to fight it, the music will suffer. In talking about finesse here, I've really covered most of the bases when it comes to performance. The piece is as demanding to conduct as it is to sing, because a good conductor will feed the singers every detail at just the right moment through gesture, face, and breath. And that means you really have to be on top of the piece. You are the master, especially of the phrasing, so make use of every shape and gesture at your disposal to guide it. Apart from the obvious musical benefits, you also want to make watching you indispensable, so that they do watch you. The choir should be transfixed on you for as much of this piece as is humanly possible, because that way they are communicating with the audience too. Let them see the whites of your eyes. Frankly, the piece will fail if singers' heads are in copies. It needs to be intense and engaged, and maybe even a little uncomfortable for the audience to face off against. If you pull this off, it will be breathtaking. In case it's not clear, I think this is a stupendous piece of music. The fact that one composer can produce something like this one day, so devout and dark, and the next day be prattling around with children's cartoons, speaks to Poulenc's incredible versatility. And he's one of the most rewarding composers I know for an accomplished choir to work on. So, give it a go, and see you around another time for another deep dive.